Do you smell that? It's the persistent scent of ozone and industrial grease, the sharp tang of salt air filtered through thousands of tons of vibrating steel, the deep, cold breath of the engine rooms mixed with the void above the waves. That's the smell of life aboard a vessel far from shore, slicing through the Pacific Northwest. If you hear a knock, don't answer it. This story begins where logic breaks down, deep inside the hull of a vessel that sails routes where reality itself seems to thin. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from right now, and what time the shadows are deepest in your corner of the world. Breathe in, breathe out, and follow my voice into the shadows. My name is Silas, and for the better part of a decade, I specialized in failure analysis for maritime architecture. I look at blueprints, I look at the physical ship, and I make sure they match. Simple, right? Steel is tangible. Geometry is constant. This is a universe governed by numbers, ballast, and displacement. At least, that's what I believed before I boarded the Tantalus Wave. The Tantalus Wave is a heavy-weather cruiser, built in 2008 for the unforgiving run between Seattle and the Alaskan ports. I was brought in after a highly decorated chief engineer, a man named Henderson, started filing incident reports that made zero mathematical sense. He was about to retire, a pillar of scientific conservatism, and his reports detailed a structural impossibility. The problem centered on Deck 7, midship, port side. According to every single archived digital and paper blueprint from the dry dock, there was a stateroom located there, cabin D709. An interior cabin, perfectly standard. Henderson first noticed the discrepancy during a routine 5-year structural survey. He was attempting to verify the length of the central corridor, the main artery of Deck 7. This involves a grounding fact of maritime engineering, the use of high-precision laser triangulation. You set your markers, shoot the beam, and you get a millimeter-accurate measurement of distance. The blueprint said the corridor was 192 meters long. The laser said 186.2 meters. He remeasured. He recalibrated the sensors. He brought in 2 different external survey teams. They all returned the same reading. The hallway was almost 6 meters, about 18 feet, shorter than the steel plans claimed. The space for cabin D709, plus the small utility closet next to it, simply did not exist. I remember standing in that hallway the first night I arrived, the ship humming around us like a massive, sleeping beast. The corridor was narrow, carpeted in thick, dark blue wool, lit by automated recessed fixtures. I put my hand flat on the wall where the door to D709 should have been. It felt solid, cold, and utterly continuous. Behind this wall, according to the plans, should have been a room 18 feet deep, ending at the firebreak bulkhead. But the internal schematics showed the firebreak bulkhead was exactly where my hand was resting. "Where did the steel go, Silas?" Henderson asked me, his voice thin, dry as old rust. "It's not shifted. It's not crushed. It's just absent." This wasn't an architectural mistake. This was a violation of volume. The terrifying part wasn't the missing space. It was the overwhelming documentary evidence proving the cabin was fully operational. I pored over the ship's internal logistics database. Cabin D709 had been fully booked on 98% of all sailings since 2008. We had keycard logs showing passengers, often the same repeating clientele, entering and exiting that location. We had housekeeping manifests proving the room was serviced. The stewardess for that section, a seasoned woman named Maria, swore that D709 was often the quietest, cleanest cabin on her rotation. "They are lovely people," she had insisted, describing an elderly couple from Nebraska who booked it every April. Always leave a generous tip. They came and went this morning, just before the muster drill. We checked the security footage. The cameras covering that segment of the hallway captured movement. You would see figures walk up to the exact spot where the door should have been, pause, and then continue down the hall. But sometimes, especially late at night, the footage was baffling. A passenger would walk down the corridor, approach the solid wall where the cabin entrance was marked on the diagram affixed nearby, and then simply vanish from the frame for an elapsed period of time consistent with them having entered a stateroom. Minutes later, they would reappear, continuing their journey. Did they turn around, obscured by the low angle of the camera? Yes, that's the rational explanation. But the frequency, the consistency, always at that exact spot, always for an average of 6 to 8 hours overnight. It began to feel less like a coincidence and more like a subtle, digital forgery. The ship isn't just lying to us, Silas, Henderson whispered one evening, looking at the schematics under the harsh glare of the engineering room lamps. It's maintaining the lie for everyone else. My initial report leaned heavily on cognitive bias and confirmation error. The staff believed the cabin was there. Therefore, they processed sensory input as if it were. But the laser measurement did not have a cognitive bias. The laser beam, which calculates distance by measuring the time of flight of photons, proved the structure was mathematically short. Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us. In this case, it was about imagining the volume of space that should have contained a standard, aluminum-walled stateroom, but which was, factually, compressed into zero. This leads to the speculative concept we reluctantly entertained. The Pacific Northwest route, known for its deep trenches and magnetic anomalies, acts as a filter, allowing the ship to occasionally pass through a localized spatial void. The ship's structure remains intact because the missing section is still part of the ship's physical volume, just folded into an accessible, non-Euclidean pocket outside our dimension. The passenger manifest still showed the occupants of D-709. They still showed up for dinner reservations, signed for spa treatments, and posed for pictures with the official photographers. Pictures that were always slightly indistinct, faces shadowed, details blurred. They existed fully on paper and in the memories of the staff, but their lodging, their home base on this giant moving city, was structurally missing. Henderson tried something desperate. He didn't tell me until after the fact. He used a specialized deep penetration sonar array, normally used to map the seabed, and aimed it laterally into the wall where D-709 should have been. He was trying to map the internal density. The first sweep, conducted at 11 a.m., returned a simple, solid wall, confirming the 186.2-meter corridor length. Nothing unusual. He ran the sonar again at 3 a.m., deep in the absolute silence of the midnight watch. This time, the sonar bounced back traces, not of air or simple void, but of low-density material consistent with light, assembled furniture, moving at slight variance with the ship's own steady vibration. The distance the signal traveled before returning implied that the space had subtly stretched back into existence, not the full 18 feet, but maybe 12 feet. He was ecstatic, terrified, but scientifically validated. The geometry wasn't static. It was fluid. He called me the next morning, heart pounding in his voice. Silas, I got it. It shifts. It breathes. We just have to measure it simultaneously when it's fully extended. We raced back down to Deck 7 with the laser triangulators and the sonar. We checked the blueprints. We prepared the equipment. We initiated the measurements. The laser locked onto the far bulkhead. The sonar pinged. The corridor measured 192.1 meters. The entire 18 feet of missing space, cabin D-709, was back. The hallway was exactly as long as the blueprint stated. We stared at the blank, solid wall where the door should have been. If the cabin was back, where was the door? And if the corridor was now structurally 192 meters long, then the earlier measurements, all 6 of them taken over 2 weeks, must have been wrong. Except, the digital logs of the laser devices confirmed the shorter measurement had been recorded, verified, and timestamped just 48 hours earlier. Henderson collapsed into a nearby utility bench, holding his head. "No," he muttered. "The paperwork is fixed. The reality is fluid." Later that evening, the keycard log for D-709 showed the Nebraskan couple had checked out. Housekeeping confirmed the room was clean and ready for the next sailing. We measured the corridor again, just before turning in. It was 186.2 meters. The 6 meters of space had silently, cleanly, vanished again, leaving the structural walls exactly where they belonged, flush against the firebreak bulkhead. The ship contained a hole, and that hole contained an inhabited room, and both the hole and the room existed only when the geometry decided to allow it. We had established the horrific baseline. The Tantalus Wave was sailing not just through water, but through dimensional seams. And this was just the first anomaly Henderson had filed. The incident with cabin D-709 proved one chilling principle. If the structure could bend, then the rules of perception must also be malleable. The documents and the laser measurements contradicted each other, leaving us trapped between objective reality, the ship is short, and objective evidence. The ship's logs confirm it is full. But the next report Henderson gave me didn't deal with spatial geometry. It dealt with time itself. It came from Captain Vane, who ran one of the crucial auxiliary vessels, a large, motorized tender, the Voyager, used to ferry passengers from the anchored Tantalus Wave into the shallow port towns. This job is relentless, precise, and utterly monotonous. Vane was a good witness, a man whose life revolved around tide tables, chronometers, and synchronized dock scheduling. His report covered a morning transfer operation near Juneau. The air was cold, the water choppy, and the rhythm of the ferry service was set. 20 minutes for the round trip, 10 minutes on the dock for turnaround. Vane detailed the morning of April 14th. The first launch was smooth. Among the passengers were a family of 4, mother, father, 2 teenagers, dressed in distinctive canary yellow rain gear. They were loud, jovial, and clearly excited about their first shore excursion. Vane had been distracted while logging the manifest, juggling his clipboard and a steaming mug of black coffee. A slight lurch of the Tantalus Wave as they disembarked the gangway, and he sloshed the coffee, a dark, viscous stripe, down the front of the father's bright yellow jacket. "My profound apologies, sir," Vane recalled saying. The father was annoyed, but waved it off. The yellow family stepped onto the Voyager, signed the clipboard, and were shuttled toward shore. Vane returned to the ship, docked, began loading the second wave of passengers. He was scanning the faces, performing his routine safety check, when he felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Stepping onto the gangway, signing the clipboard, was the same family of 4. Identical yellow jackets, identical loud chatter, identical children snapping identical photos. "Excuse me, sir," Vane said to the father. "Didn't I just take you ashore?" The father looked at him blankly, annoyed at the delay. "No, Captain. This is our first time off the ship this morning. We just got off the breakfast rotation." Vane glanced quickly at the father's chest. The yellow jacket was pristine. The dark stripe of coffee he had absolutely, physically spilled on the previous iteration of this man 20 minutes ago was absent. This is where Vane's grounding fact came into play. He was a stickler for detail, knowing that insurance, liability, and safety depended on log integrity. Every passenger manifest is sequential with individual identifiers. He checked his clipboard. The signature line for this yellow family was blank, ready for their names. The previous manifest, the one that recorded the coffee stain incident, was officially complete and timestamped 8:05 a.m. He felt the first cold prickle of true disorientation. He told himself he was tired. Cabin fever. The mind placed tricks in the face of monotony. He ferried this second, yellow family ashore, watching them exit the tender and merge into the port crowd. He returned to the Tantalus Wave, began loading the third wave, and there they were again. This time, Vane didn't speak. He checked the clock on the port wall. It read 9:07 a.m. He checked the clock on his personal phone, 9:07 a.m. He checked the ship's official chronometer, 9:07 a.m. All three were perfectly synchronized, marking the passage of time normally. But he had just dropped off the second version of the yellow family minutes ago. This was physically impossible. Shore excursions are logged and final. The ship's automated system prevents rebooking or duplicate checkouts. Yet, here they stood, signatures pending. As the third father stepped aboard, Vane's hand, shaking slightly, reached out and accidentally nudged the man's jacket with the same coffee cup. A new, wet, steaming stripe of black coffee dyed the yellow fabric. The man cursed under his breath. Vane apologized profusely, noting the details of the stain, size, location, drip pattern. He completed the transfer. He returned to the ship. He loaded the fourth wave of passengers, and then the fifth, and the sixth. The trips bled into one another, Vane operating on pure, mechanical adrenaline, his mind screaming against the sequential reality of the morning. Around the 11th trip, when the dock clock showed 10:45 a.m., Vane watched the yellow family approach for the 11th time. He was nearly catatonic from the repetition. This time, when the father stepped onto the gangway, Vane saw it. The dark stripe of coffee he had spilled just 40 minutes ago was already there. It was dried, stiff, and perfectly matched the pattern of the stain he had inflicted on the third iteration of the man. The coffee stain was a physical tether, a mark of interaction that transcended the loop. This meant that the iterations weren't simply replacing themselves. The timeline was resetting, but certain physical markers, like the stain, were skipping the reset, being woven into the fabric of the newly started sequence. Vane stopped the loading process. He grabbed his manifest log, the physical clipboard, and ran into the ship's security office. He checked his own phone log. The ship's central log, the port authority's electronic record, and the timestamps on the security camera footage all confirmed that Captain Vane had completed 27 separate transfers between 8 a.m. and 10:45 a.m. 27 trips. Captain Vane, sweating and incoherent, testified that he only remembered 13. The numbers were horrifying. The objective record showed twice the physical activity Vane remembered performing. Where did those 14 missing trips go? And why did his memory only retain the initial, marked trips? Reflective thought. If sequence disappears, causality dies with it. Vane had been trapped in a local, temporal anomaly where cause and effect were folding back on themselves, making him perform the same actions, ferrying the same, unmarked families, over and over, while the ship's clock recorded the sequential passage of physical time. The speculative concept we faced was a phenomenon known in theoretical physics as chronological compression, where localized temporal fields fold back upon themselves due to external energy spikes, perhaps the massive geothermal activity of the inside passage. The area of the tender operation, a narrow path between the ship and the shore, became a zone where time was not linear, but helical. Vane was experiencing subjective compression, while the external world recorded objective, linear progression. The real chilling implication came when we cross-referenced the Yellow family's records. The central database showed they only checked out once at 8:05 a.m. They returned to the ship at 4:30 p.m., exactly on schedule. This meant that the 26 other iterations of the family Vane ferried to shore simply did not exist in the ship's digital system. They were phantom passengers created by the time loop itself, a necessary part of the ship's delusion to maintain the illusion of continuous activity. They were people who existed solely in the physical space of the temporal anomaly, fading back into the void when the loop reset. We reviewed the maintenance logs for the Voyager. Between 8 a.m. and 10:45 a.m., the tender boat had consumed 3 times the average amount of fuel for that period, fully corroborating the official record of 27 trips. Vane had physically done the work, but his mind had rejected the painful, existential monotony of the repetition, erasing the loops it could not reconcile. I stared at the security feed of Vane, frantic and exhausted, running toward the security office at 10:45 a.m. On the timeline, the 27 trips looked like rapid, sequential blurs of activity. But when I slowed the tape, I could see the moment of pure fracture. Trip 4, Trip 9, Trip 18. At those moments, Vane paused on the gangway, looking wildly at the port clock, a tiny, almost imperceptible hiccup in his mechanical efficiency, before he accepted the sight of the Yellow family approaching him again, their faces scrubbed clean of memory, ready to start their shore excursion for the 10th time. It wasn't just a ghost in the machine. It was the machine trying to run the same program infinitely, and the human operator being forced to live through the endless repetition. The events surrounding the tender boat proved that not only could space be folded, but time could be locally compressed. The ship, I realized, was operating within a complex field of reality distortion. But the next file Henderson handed me introduced an element that was far more sinister than structural or temporal warping: intelligent, predictive malice. This report came from the ship's primary radio officer, a quiet, analytical woman named Alara. Her domain was the highest point of the ship, a world of static, interference, and the cold, inhuman chatter of global navigation systems. The incident occurred during a particularly dense, soupy fog bank that had settled over the Inside Passage, near Vancouver Island. This area, famous for its unpredictable microclimates and sharp coastal jutouts, requires constant vigilance. The most critical landmark in the vicinity is the Point Coda Lighthouse, a towering, skeletal structure perched on a sheer cliff face. Alara knew her grounding fact. Point Coda was fully automated in 1996. Its massive Fresnel lens now rotates silently, powered by solar arrays, monitored remotely from Victoria. No human has lived there for almost 30 years. Around 2 o'clock hours, navigating blind through the impenetrable fog, Alara's vintage VHF receiver, which she kept for atmospheric hobby monitoring, suddenly burst to life. It wasn't the usual white noise or weather broadcast. It was a clear, strong voice. The voice was deep, resonant, and possessed the clipped, formal diction of a man who spent decades talking only to the vast, indifferent sea. MS Tantalus Wave, this is Point Coda Light Station, the voice crackled. Fog is heavy. Visibility 0. Recommend course correction west-southwest. Alara grabbed the microphone instantly. Point Coda, this is the Tantalus Wave. We acknowledge. Thank you for the active support. Who am I speaking with? A long silence followed, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic grinding of the automated lens mechanism. Then the voice returned, sounding infinitely closer, almost breathing into the headset. They call me the keeper, girl. Been here since the water was colder and the living were still, the voice said, the words strangely elongated. I see the lists. I see the departures. Alara glanced at her console. The automated signal beacon from Point Coda was operating perfectly, sending its coded chirp. The station was transmitting nothing on the voice channels. Yet, the voice was loud and immediate. The keeper continued, ignoring Alara's formal query. He began reading off a list. He started with passenger names, first and last, repeating their full identification. Alara checked the ship's active manifest against the names the man was reciting. Perfect matches. Then the voice drifted into details that should have been sealed under strict privacy controls. Medical data. Mr. Thomas Vance, cabin D, 511. Recent cardiac stent, primary hypertension, prescribed warfarin. Mrs. Elena Santos, cabin E832. Severe peanut allergy, history of panic attacks. Last visit to ship, doctor 1900 hours for insomnia. Alara's blood ran cold. This information was confidential. It resided only in the ship doctor's secure network and the guest services database. It was not broadcast. It certainly was not available to a theoretically automated, unmanned lighthouse 20 miles away. Keeper, I am requesting your identity and authorization level. You are transmitting restricted information, Alara managed to say, her voice shaking slightly. The keeper chuckled, a dry, rasping sound like stone grinding on sand. Authorization? The sea authorizes me. I am the man who sees the holes, girl. And your ship is carrying 3 weights that the abyss requires. The voice then proceeded to list 3 specific passengers. Cabin A, 302, Mr. Julian Thorne. Cabin G, 988, Ms. Lena Kale. And Cabin B, 405, a child, Noah Finch. Thorne leaves us the night of the 3rd watch. Kale departs the deck of the midnight hour. Finch will simply not arrive. Then, as suddenly as it began, the transmission ended. The VHF static returned to its normal, lifeless hiss. Alara checked the logs. Her equipment showed a clean, empty frequency. No incoming voice transmission was ever recorded by the ship's official systems, a detail that was both a relief, no security breach, and a horror. The voice existed outside measurable reality. Alara was professional. She filed a classified security report, including the names and the cryptic predictions. Henderson and I received the file with extreme skepticism. It's a hoax, I argued. An elaborate, personalized prank by someone with high-level access to the internal network. Maybe a disgruntled former crew member. Henderson pointed to the prediction concerning Mr. Julian Thorne, Cabin A, 302. Thorne leaves us the night of the 3rd watch. 4 nights later, during the 3 to 7 o'clock watch, the 3rd watch, Mr. Julian Thorne vanished. Thorne had gone to bed, attested to by his wife, who was sleeping beside him. At 3:45, she awoke, finding the bed empty. Thorne's jacket, wallet, and passport were still in the room. His keycard was scanned for an exit at the main deck 3 service door leading to the open aft deck, timed at 3:33 a.m. Security footage showed the door opening and closing, but the angle was blocked by a utility truck parked there. No one was seen. Extensive search and rescue efforts were launched. Nothing was found. Thorne had simply ceased to be. The ship log recorded him as missing, presumed lost at sea. We revisited Alara's log with sickening realization. The keeper's prophecy was not a threat. It was a factual report from a timeline slightly ahead of our own. The speculative concept here is that the Point Coda lighthouse acts as an axis point, a psychic beacon broadcasting from a dimensional overlap. The old keeper, a spirit or an entity inextricably tied to the coordinates, has access to the ship's collective temporal record, past, present, and future events related to death and disappearance in that localized area. The voice continued to transmit, specifically whenever the Tantalus Wave passed Point Coda in heavy fog. Alara learned to brace herself for the sound. It became a reflective thought of profound dread. We were not sailing forward. We were sailing along a pre-written track, and the old man in the silent lighthouse was merely reading the script aloud. On the third successful voyage after Thorn's disappearance, Alara monitored the frequency again. The fog was thick. The voice returned, its tone flat, repertorial. Ms. Lena Kale, cabin G, 988. Will depart the deck of the midnight hour. Tonight. Alara alerted the captain instantly. They sealed Deck 9, the location of Kale's cabin, which featured a small, open-air promenade, the deck of the midnight hour. Security teams were deployed. At 23:58, security camera footage showed Ms. Lena Kale, fully dressed in evening wear, calmly stepping out of her room. She walked toward the sealed exit to the promenade. A security officer intercepted her just before midnight. He asked if she was okay. She seemed confused, dazed. She couldn't articulate why she was there, or where she thought she was going. She insisted she was merely going for a breath of fresh air, though the night was cold and the deck was locked down. The captain ordered Kale confined to her room for her own safety. We had beaten the prophecy, but at 0:03, the ship's medical alarm blared. Ms. Lena Kale had suffered a sudden, massive stroke in her cabin, collapsing instantly. She died 47 minutes later, despite the valiant efforts of the ship's medical staff. She did not physically depart the deck of the midnight hour, but the keeper's prediction of her removal from the ship's manifest was chillingly accurate, timed precisely to the midnight threshold. The child, Noah Finch, remains on the manifest. We check his records every trip. He is the last weight the abyss requires, and the silent lighthouse is waiting to confirm his disappearance. The realization that the Tantalus Wave was sailing a deterministic track, a track read out to us by a spectral lighthouse keeper, was a profound blow to the crew's morale. They were professionals, deeply skeptical, yet the evidence of the vanishing space, the folding time, and the accurate prophecy was physically, scientifically undeniable. The ship was a vessel of paradox. My next focus shifted to the engine room, the absolute heart of the ship, where pure power and mechanical reality hold sway. If the laws of physics failed anywhere, it shouldn't be here. But this is where Henderson had accumulated reports regarding a highly specific, repeatable phenomenon involving cold, wet intrusion. The witness was Tate, a young technician from the Philippines, deeply skilled in thermodynamics and hydraulic pressure maintenance. Tate was on the overnight watch, monitoring the massive, sealed steel fire doors that separate the primary engine room from the service corridors, a critical safety barrier designed to withstand hours of intense heat. His grounding fact was simple. Those doors are watertight, airtight, and sealed. They are electronically locked from the bridge and the local control panel and are only opened for scheduled maintenance or emergency access. They do not permit casual pedestrian traffic. At approximately 3:30 a.m., Tate was reviewing pressure gauges when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, annoyed, believing a crew member had accessed the secured area without logging in. Standing just inside the secondary corridor, facing the sealed door to the engine room, was a man. He was drenched, absolutely soaked through his light gray sweater and trousers, dripping cold seawater onto the grimy steel deck plates. He wasn't wearing shoes, and his feet were pale, blistered, and blue with cold. "Sir, you shouldn't be here," Tate called out, walking toward him. "How did you get past the lock?" The man didn't seem to hear him. He just looked past Tate, toward the deafening, throbbing machinery, his eyes wide and vacant. He opened his mouth, and the sound that came out was a hollow whisper, barely audible over the roar of the engines. "When will we arrive?" Tate approached him, intending to escort the man to the sick bay for acute hypothermia treatment. "Sir, we are due in port at 6 o'clock. You need medical attention right now." The passenger simply repeated the question, "When will we arrive?" Tate reached out to touch his arm, intending to guide him away from the machinery. The moment his fingers brushed the man's wet sleeve, Tate felt a shock of profound, bone-deep cold. He recoiled instinctively. And then, the impossible happened. The drenched man took one step toward the massive, sealed steel door, a sheet of metal 3 inches thick, and he simply walked through it. There was no sound of impact, no warping of the metal, no visible gap. One moment he was standing in the corridor. The next, he was gone, absorbed by the solid steel. Tate stood there for a full minute, staring at the continuous metal door. Had he hallucinated it? Fatigue, stress, the deafening noise. These were common explanations for sensory error. He ran to the local control panel, checked the access log for the door. It was still locked. No entry, no exit. But his thermal imaging scanner, which he used to check for heat leaks in the ventilation stacks, was still active on his wrist. When he aimed the camera at the door where the man had disappeared, the reading was immediate and chilling. A distinct, human-shaped thermal shadow was moving on the surface of the steel. Not heat, but profound cold. The area the man had passed through registered dozens of degrees below zero. An intense thermal vacuum momentarily imprinted on the structure. This cold trace slowly, visibly dissipated over the next 2 minutes, leaving the door plate uniformly warm again. Tate filed the incident immediately, complete with the thermal imaging logs. When Henderson analyzed the data, he confirmed the cold signature, a localized area of extreme negative enthalpy, consistent with a body suffering catastrophic hypothermia. This led to the speculative concept that the ship carried its own, recurring, spectral passengers, ghosts tied inextricably to the geometry of the tragedy. Henderson ran the description of the man through the company archives. Wet, shoeless, gray sweater, specific build. The match was devastating. In 1997, on the same Seattle-Alaska route, a passenger named Victor Reyes fell overboard during a storm surge. The Coast Guard searched for days. Reyes was wearing a gray sweater and was known to wander the decks without his shoes, suffering from chronic insomnia. His body was never recovered. He was logged as lost at sea. The records showed that Reyes had asked the exact same question of every crew member he encountered just hours before his disappearance. "When will we arrive?" We realized that this apparition was not random. It was a recurrent temporal echo, a loop of tragedy, tied specifically to the coordinates and perhaps the weather conditions. Every year, around the anniversary of his death, when the sea temperature dropped to a certain level, Victor Reyes would physically manifest in the hull of the ship, forever cold, forever lost, forever seeking reassurance he would never receive. He was physically cold enough to register on a thermal camera, yet solid enough to walk through 3 inches of steel without disturbing it. Tate became terrified of the engine room. Every night, before the third watch, he would take photos of the sealed steel door, hoping to provide a grounding fact of normal emptiness. One night, the thermal camera captured more than a lingering cold spot. It captured tiny, perfectly formed, wet footprints leading from the main corridor, stopping at the steel door, and then reappearing on the other side of the firebreak bulkhead, inside the engine room proper. Reyes wasn't a shadow. He was a passenger that existed outside the ship's material constraints, using the vessel as a temporary shell. passing through its physical laws as easily as breath. Reflective thought. The ship is not just a container for the living. It is a ritual site where the past returns, cold and demanding, asking the same question over and over, trapped in the loop of its final, desperate moments. The incident was confirmed weeks later by another crew member. A deck supervisor during an early morning check found a puddle of freezing salt water in the sealed utility compartment on Deck 2. The compartment was locked. Inside, a single, waterlogged gray sweater, the exact style Reyes was wearing in his file photo, was draped over a piping manifold. When the supervisor reported the garment, the sweater vanished an hour later, leaving only the puddle. The sweater was a physical object, briefly pulled back into our dimension by the strength of the spectral loop, only to dissolve when the focus shifted away. Victor Reyes was still on board. He was still waiting to arrive. The Tantalus Wave was quickly revealing itself to be a kind of slow-motion wreckage, a collection of structural voids and temporal glitches, navigated by the desperate echoes of the dead. But the most unsettling file Henderson presented dealt not with vanishing spaces or ghostly passengers, but with a synchronized, mass casualty event that left absolutely no physical trace. This came from Dr. Zaria, the ship's primary physician. She was meticulous, sharp, and relied purely on quantifiable data, heart rates, blood pressure, toxicology, and neurological responses. Her report concerned the midnight incident that occurred on Deck 11, the exclusive area of the high-end dining and lounges. Dr. Zaria logged 17 simultaneous medical emergencies reported across Deck 11 at exactly 3:07 a.m. on a Monday morning. The symptoms were uniform and acute: severe, sudden tachycardia, heart rates spiking over 140 bpm, extreme pupillary dilation, and dangerously low core body temperature, bordering on clinical hypothermia. All 17 passengers were rushed to the sick bay. Dr. Zaria's team immediately stabilized them, but the patients were experiencing mass disorientation and low-grade delirium. When questioned, all 17 victims, who had no previous connection to one another, independently offered the exact same story. They claimed they had attended a special, unannounced midnight buffet on Deck 11. They described entering a hidden service lounge that had been converted into a decadent, dimly lit dining room. They described rich, unusual decor, heavy velvet drapes, and an atmosphere of decadent secrecy. Crucially, they all claimed to have eaten the main course, a strange, pale meat, tough and stringy, served with an unfamiliar, intensely sweet berry reduction. They said the meat tasted vaguely of brine and despair, but they were compelled to continue eating. They also all described the service staff. They were elderly men in severe, black and white uniforms that Dr. Zaria instantly recognized as the Tantalus Wave's original 2008 staff livery, which had been permanently discontinued 7 years ago. Every passenger specifically mentioned the lead server, a tall, gaunt man with a deep, ugly scar running vertically through his left eyebrow. Dr. Zaria ran toxicology screens, looking for psychotropic drugs, food poisoning, or carbon monoxide. Every test came back perfectly clean. The symptoms were physiological, extreme stress response, but the catalyst was invisible. This is where the grounding fact of the Tantalus Wave's architecture came into play. Deck 11's dining facilities closed promptly at 2300 hours. The entire area was secured with internal magnetic locks and motion detectors. After 2300 hours, the lights were off, the kitchen sealed, and all access was restricted to security patrol only. I was brought in to check the integrity of the area. We reviewed the camera footage from 23 to 3:07 a.m. The cameras proved unequivocally, that the Deck 11 dining area remained dark, locked, and completely empty. Not a single person, passenger or crew, entered the secure zone during those hours. The motion detectors remained silent. There was no buffet. There was no service staff. There was no pale meat. Yet, 17 physically healthy people experienced simultaneous, life-threatening medical trauma based on a shared, detailed, sensory hallucination. Dr. Zaria focused on the duration of the symptoms. All 17 patients exhibited tachycardia, dilation, and hypothermia for exactly 3 hours. At 6:07 a.m., precisely 3 hours after the incident, the symptoms vanished simultaneously, as if a switch had been flipped. Heart rates returned to normal. Pupils contracted. Core temperature stabilized. They woke up, confused, but physically sound. Reflective thought. The horror of the void is not the absence of things, but the existence of things that leave no trace in the world we measure. The midnight buffet was a perfectly constructed, collective reality that only existed for the subjective experience of the people drawn into it. The speculative concept became evident. The ship occasionally hosts events that are native only to its dimensional slipstream. The midnight buffet was an event that occurred in the fold, a temporary annex of the ship's reality that passengers were somehow pulled into, existing outside the visual range of the ship's cameras, but still close enough for the visceral effects. The taste of the meat, the shock of the cold, the terror of the gaunt server, to manifest as physical trauma upon their return. I became obsessed with the lead server, the man with the scarred left eyebrow. I went through old crew photos until I found him. Barnaby, a waiter who had been fired in 2012 for chronic insubordination. He had died in 2015 in a motorcycle accident on shore. He was, therefore, not simply a discontinued uniform. He was a spectral host, running a service that only the dead or the dimensionally displaced could attend. Dr. Zaria confirmed that one of the patients, a middle-aged woman named Iris, had been particularly traumatized. Iris had insisted that when she reached out to ask the scarred waiter what the strange meat was, he hadn't answered verbally. He had leaned close and whispered a single word into her ear. Finch. Noah Finch, Cabin B, 405. The child named by the keeper of Point Coda as the third weight required by the Abyss. We cross-referenced the 17 victims. They had nothing in common, except for one eerie detail. 6 of them had interacted with or seen the occupants of the missing cabin, D-709, on previous sailings. 3 others had been on Captain Vane's tender during the time loop incident. They were, in short, people already sensitized to the ship's internal madness. They were receptive. The final piece of evidence. When cleaning the sick bay after the patients were released, the nursing staff found tiny, dried husks of unfamiliar, unnaturally sweet berries scattered on the sheets of the beds where the victims had slept. They were an indigenous Alaskan variety, not carried by the ship's catering supply, highly perishable, and known in folklore to grow only near ancient burial sites. The physical trace of the unfeast was minimal, a scattering of phantom berries and the lingering memory of spectral meat. But the reality of the terror was logged in the 17 recovered heart monitor strips. The Tantalus Wave was offering its passengers a glimpse into the shadows, a dangerous taste of the abyss. The cumulative reports painted a picture of a vessel not bound by physics, operating as a conduit between reality and its opposite. We had seen vanishing spaces, repeated time, accurate death prophecies, and shared phantom experiences. Yet, the final file Henderson gave me detailed the most audacious and existentially shattering incident of all, the ship encountering itself. This report came directly from Captain Erickson, a man renowned for his cool head and strict adherence to protocol. It involved the ship's primary navigation and detection systems, the radar, which uses radio waves to map physical objects, and the automatic identification system, AIS, which broadcasts a ship's identity, course, and speed globally. The event took place deep in the Inside Passage, a vast, dark stretch of water known for its profound acoustic depth and magnetic interference, occurring shortly after 1 a.m. Captain Erickson, First Officer Vance, and Second Officer Leong were on the bridge, the night quiet and clear. Suddenly, the radar screen registered a large, complex target exactly 40 nautical miles dead ahead. A large vessel, not unusual, but the AIS transponder associated with the target was alarming. The name broadcasting from 40 miles ahead was MS Tantalus Wave. Check the calibration, Vance. Erickson ordered instantly. Self-reporting is impossible. The system must be reading an old ghost track, or there was a catastrophic software malfunction. Vance checked the system. The AIS was receiving a live, active signal. The vessel 40 miles ahead was reporting the exact same length, beam, draft, tonnage, and maximum speed as their own ship. It was broadcasting their exact identification number. Erickson's stomach dropped. This was beyond mechanical error. Call them on VHF Channel 16, he commanded. Vance switched the radio to the emergency channel and transmitted the standard identification query. The reply was immediate, clear, and perfectly terrifying. The voice that returned was deep, measured, and distinctly Captain Erickson's own voice. Unidentified vessel. This is the MS Tantalus Wave, standing by. Identify yourself immediately. The voice was Erickson's, but it was displaced by exactly 7 seconds. It was a live echo of the call he had just made. The other vessel was answering them using the captain's own vocal pattern, 7 seconds late. Erickson grabbed the microphone, his hands white-knuckled. "This is Captain Erickson of the Tantalus Wave," he announced firmly. "Identify your vessel and location." 7 seconds later, the echo returned. "This is Captain Erickson of the Tantalus Wave. Identify your vessel and location." This confirmed the speculative concept we had feared. They were looking at a duplicate, not a reflection, but an identical, independently operating ship that existed in phase with their own. Erickson made a tactical decision. He ordered an immediate, full-throttle acceleration. If this was a glitch, speed might break the visual lock. The Tantalus Wave surged forward, the powerful engines vibrating through the hull. They were doing 22 knots. They watched the distance gauge on the radar. In normal physics, at their speed, it should take them approximately 2 hours to close the 40-mile gap. The distance began to close rapidly, abnormally fast. Within 20 minutes, the distance had shrunk to less than 5 miles. The duplicate ship was closing the distance at speeds physically impossible for a vessel of that size, or their own speed was being artificially amplified by a spatial anomaly. Erickson had the crew prepare for impact, though he knew collision was impossible. An exact replica should logically occupy the same spatial coordinates, negating mass. The radar screen showed the two identical AIS tracks converging. The atmosphere on the bridge was electric with fear and absolute awe. At 1:47 a.m., the two targets merged on the radar. The screen flashed a bright, blinding green, and every system on the bridge, every digital clock, every navigational aid, froze for a single, silent moment. There was no physical impact. There was no sound, no lurch, no jolt. When the systems rebooted and the radar cleared, the duplicate Tantalus Wave was gone. The sea was empty. The AIS signal had dissolved. Erickson looked at his watch. It read 2:34 a.m. He looked at the ship's primary electronic clock, which was tied to the GPS system. It read 2:34 a.m. Everything was normal. The ship's log recorded a continuous voyage. No anomaly, no jump, no lost time. But First Officer Vance checked his wrist chronometer. It read 1:47 a.m. Second Officer Leong checked his personal phone clock, synchronized to a different cellular tower network. It read 1:47 a.m. Erickson checked his own, highly accurate, mechanical watch. 1:47 a.m. 47 minutes of time had vanished. The three officers on the bridge had experienced the convergence at 1:47 a.m., but the ship's central system, tied to the spatial coordinates of our dimension, insisted that 47 minutes had passed normally, progressing to 2:34 a.m. This was the ultimate grounding fact of the ship's condition. The human mind, anchored to personal experience, had recorded the temporal anomaly, but the ship, existing primarily as a structure in this reality, had papered over the gap. The ship was more real than the people sailing it. The Tantalus Wave had folded into its own reflection, and when the two realities overlapped, the physical world processed the event by simply deleting the elapsed time from the subjective consciousness of the witnesses. The crew existed in the loop. The ship existed outside it. Erickson logged the incident, sealing it under multiple security classifications. The phenomenon repeated 2 more times on subsequent voyages, each time with a different time loss, 32 minutes, 51 minutes, and each time, only the human witnesses experienced the gap. The ship's digital timeline remained flawless. This final report crystallized the horror. The Tantalus Wave was not merely passing through anomalies, it was generating them. The cumulative weight of its history, the missing staterooms, the repeated time loops, the spectral deaths, the unfed buffets, and the cold passengers, had turned the vessel itself into a massive, mobile fracture point. We discovered that this phenomenon of the vanishing stateroom, the prophetic voice, and the self-reflection had been reported not just on the Tantalus Wave, but on at least 4 other major cruise ships operating the same Seattle-Alaska routes over the last 2 decades. The void wasn't ship-specific, it was route-specific. The sea itself was haunted. The crew are all veterans. They believe in the data, in the paper, in the science. And when the data, the paper, and the science all point to a complete contradiction, when the logbooks say the trip was normal, but the watches on their wrists insist 47 minutes are missing, they realize that they are not just transporting passengers. They are ferrying the living across the abyss, and the abyss sometimes pulls its own reflections and demands its payments. I left the Tantalus Wave 2 months after I arrived, without a single coherent report to file. The only thing I could confirm was that every piece of contradictory evidence, the sonar logs, the faded coffee stain, the heart monitors, the thermal traces, the 47-minute time gap, was technically, factually correct. And somewhere on the next sailing, the automated lighthouse will speak again, confirming the departure of Noah Finch, Cabin B, 405, the last weight required for the ship's passage. The morning air is different when you know the dimensions of the world are elastic. It doesn't carry the promise of light. It carries the weight of all the hours that might have vanished without your knowledge. I am sitting here now, far from the sound of the ocean, but the silence still hums with the memory of the Tantalus Wave's engines. The ship is still sailing, adhering strictly to its schedule, its logs pristine, its structure, according to the latest laser measurements, exactly 192 meters long. Cabin D, 709 is fully booked for the summer season. The Yellow family is scheduled for a transfer next week. Everything is, by all accounts, normal. But normalcy on that route is a meticulously maintained fiction. The crew continues to perform their duties with a quiet, internalized dread. They know that the paper dictates their reality, even when their senses scream otherwise. They know that the coffee stain remains fixed on the ghostly coat of a passenger who was only momentarily real, and that the heat of life is measurable even when it's dozens of degrees below zero. The Tantalus Wave is a museum of dimensional failure, a floating vessel dedicated to proving that the past is never past, and that death is just another rotational shift. The stories I collected, the 10 anomalies logged by conservative, scientific professionals, are not ghost stories in the traditional sense. They are forensic reports of reality's breakdown, where the logbook and the compass needle point in two opposing directions, and both are telling the truth. I often think of the old keeper at Point Coda Lighthouse, his voice drifting through the static, reading out the inevitable conclusion of someone's journey. Perhaps he is the only truly sane entity in that cold stretch of ocean.